A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms being almost wrapped up, we only have one more episode left in the season, I figured it was time to talk about the costumes, hair, and makeup. We're going to be talking about armor, symbolism, lore, and a bit of the behind-the-scenes information regarding the wigs and the makeup. So without a further ado, this is your book spoiler warning, since we will be talking about lore and potential future events. And a little disclaimer, I'm not a fashion historian, I'm not an expert. My realm is more in connecting the costumes to, like I said, the lore, the symbolism, etc. But if you are a fashion expert or a fashion historian, feel free to sound off in the comments because insight is always welcome, and I feel like the more perspectives that we have on this, the better. So let's get into it. So starting with Dunk, I actually don't have too much to say about Dunk and his costumes for this season, other than the fact that they are incredibly book accurate. I mean, he looks straight up pulled from the graphic novels. His belt of rope is a distinct thing that's called out in the novellas, and I'm glad that they kept that in. And overall, he's dressed in a lot of kind of earthy tones, in greens and blues and grays and browns. And we see these same colors throughout a lot of the small folk characters and a lot of the characters that are humble and kind of like-minded, like Egg or like Tanzel. And I think it's really interesting how texture can really tell a story. The show has done a really good job at weathering the costumes. There's nothing I hate more than watching a show and all of the costumes look fresh out the box, just brand new, almost like cosplay. And that's not to disparage cosplayers. I'm a cosplayer. I love cosplay, but when you're trying to immerse me into a real world or convince me that this world is real, I feel like you do sometimes need a bit of weathering on the clothes. Because having no weathering can also be a statement. It could be like, oh, this character has brand new clothing, maybe they're very rich. But when you have a poor character who's living in these clothes day in, day out, probably not cleaning them a lot, walking through the mud, sleeping in them, having to mend them, you do want them to look kind of lived in and grimy. So with that, yeah, he's got a lot of texture going on. It looks very woven, a little bit rough, which makes sense for a character who is a hedge knight. And the same goes for his armor. The armor that he gets from Steely Pate is very no nonsense and again looks directly out of the graphic novels. I've seen people saying that he looks like Shrek when he becomes a human, and to that I say, nuh-uh. I mean, maybe a little bit, but like, Dunks can look like Shrek as a treat. There's nothing wrong with that. If he wants to Shrek Max, he's allowed. But yeah, those are all my thoughts on Dunk. So moving on, Egg. Egg has some very interesting costumes in this because he's a character that goes from being this kind of small folk person. He's kind of puppeting or, pretending to be a small folk, cosplaying, if you will, as a small folk. And so with that, he's got this like giant cloak, and Dexter Ansel Soul has said that the cloak was huge, and I think that was purposeful to make Egg look even smaller, but he said that the cloak was super heavy, and that, trudging around in the mud all day, it would become so heavy that he couldn't wait to take it off. And I know this probably isn't intentional, but it feels a bit ironic or a bit symbolic for the fact that Egg is hiding his identity. It's this huge blanket and this huge thing that he's carrying around with him. And so, like Dunk, he's wearing kind of, greens, and he's got this kind of like gold brown looking little rough spun tunic-y thing on, just the absolute opposite of House Targaryen colors. So it's kind of a night and day difference when we do eventually then see him dressed like a little Targaryen princeling. He's in these very rich black tones where you could kind of mistake and think that it's all one color, but when you zoom in, you see that there actually are some really interesting pattern details on these costumes. So he's got like black and red velvet. He's got this texture on his kind of body block, like jerkin area that looks almost like dragon scales or like these little diamonds that kind of evoke a dragon feel. And then he's got these little red, almost like ruffles down the sleeve that again kind of remind me almost like the little ruffles or horned kind of scales on a lizard. Overall, just very dragon-like. And we see too, with this little sash he has a couple episodes later, it's very like dragon egg textured, but a little bit abstract looking kind of dragon egg texture. And now this makes sense. Obviously, he is a Targaryen princeling. The Targaryens love their dragon prints and textures, but I can't help but feel like it's a little bit extra ironic or maybe a bit of foreshadowing that Egg is kind of covered in these dragon printy textures. It shows really the weight that this has on his house, the concept that the dragon eggs are constantly on everyone's mind. Even though the dragons are gone now, it's like House Targaryen is still taking a lot of pride in their dragon symbolism, even though it's a little bit more subdued now, it's a little bit more abstract and in the background, as opposed to, say, House of the Dragon, where the dragon textures, I feel like, are a lot more in your face in the forefront and are a lot bolder and identifiably dragon textures. So yeah, and that's kind of a through line with all the Targaryens in this in general. They are all a little bit more subdued as compared to, maybe maybe a little bit more of the ostentatious House of the Dragon Targaryens. And it makes sense too that there would be a bit of fashion evolution within House Targaryen, since it's been about 80-ish years since the Dance of the Dragons. And so yeah, just overall with Egg, we get these two very different looks for him. We get the Egg that is a member of the small folk in his kind of, rough spun, his heavy cloak, his golds and greens that are all muddy. And then we get, very put together Egg. I've seen some people say from these pictures, he got that shit on him. And yeah, he does. I love this crazy little hat they put him in to cover up his bald head. People were joking that Maekar was probably like, I don't want to see your bald little dome, put this hat on, and I think that's kind of hilarious. So love his little matching little page boy hat. It's kind of giving berries and cream a little bit. I've also seen people say too that this boy loves a little hoodie, loves a cloak, because we see him again in a different little cloak once he is revealed to be the prince. Some people have said he looks like he's out of Star Wars or something, and I could totally see that. And I wanted to add too that Dexter did shave his head for this role. Not everyone knows that. It's not a bald cap. He did fully commit. So I commend him for that. I think that is really cool. And I kind of wonder how many times they had to shave his hair during filming just for continuity to keep it like super bald. And knowing that he's gonna have to keep it bald for future seasons is also crazy. But anyways, those are my thoughts on Egg and his costumes. Moving on. Lionel Baratheon, the Laughing Storm. I really like Lionel's costumes this season. I think they are fabulous. I'm probably going to be saying that a lot in this video, fabulous. But they've done a really good job at building up this character, this Laughing Storm. He is a little bit pompous looking, but not overly pompous. He's not as pompous looking as, say, Manfred Dondarrion with his little curly coiffed hair and his furs and his like little pearl jewels. But Lionel still is showing up with that drip. It's just a little more subtle. It's a little more, I don't want to say down to earth, because this guy is sometimes up in the clouds. He is partying, he's kind of navel gazing philosophically sometimes. He's a little bit out there, but at the end of the day, he is a good person. And so yeah, a little less pompous than some of these other lords. Obviously we see that in the fact that he is willing to defend Dunk. He's willing to let in this guy who is just like a nobody, and then at the end of the night he's laughing with him, he's talking about him, he's letting him wear his crown. He is a little bit more humble and down to earth than some of these other lords. And so we see that in his costuming. He's got this gold cloak, he's got a lot of antler motifs all over him, but he's not overly flashy. He's got a little bit of a gold chain that's very fun. With the antler helm, it's very like Dionysus vibes. People have also pointed out very like antler men, green men. If you've played Skyrim, very Hircine, very party god of the hunt kind of vibes. And in this still from the last episode, it looks like he also has maybe a stag cane that is made of an antler, which is kind of fun. So just again, a lot of stag stuff with this guy. He's very prideful of his house sigil. I also want to say too, I love his fun little dangly earring. I've seen people call it his slutty little earring, and I think that is apt. I want to say too, dangly little earrings for men is a thing in the books. We see a lot of men wear dangly little earrings. We get mentionings of it. Like, for example, Ramsay Bolton wears a dangly little earring, a little blood drop earring. But the thing to note too is that men wear earrings. We don't really get mentionings of women wearing earrings. And we'll get into that a little bit more when we talk about Tanzel next. And then, of course, we have to talk about how cool his armor is. Lionel Baratheon in the books also has this just amazing antlered helm. So again, I really love that they're trying to stay as book accurate as possible with some of these costumes. I think it's just really such a treat for fans of this series. And so he has this really cool armor, and I'm just gonna say it, I really like this painted look. I like that there's the painted antlers on it, and I kind of want us to have more armor like this. Like, I get it, it's tourney armor, but hey, maybe we'll get cool tourney armor like this in the future, because I think it's a really fun look. And, in the books, they talk about enameled armor, they talk about all these really cool, very fantastical sets of armor, so I'm kind of glad that we're getting that a little bit more. Some of the armor in Game of Thrones was a little bit on the bland side, it was a little bit subdued for the sake of, quote unquote realism. So I like that we're kind of slowly doing away with that and getting into this more kind of fantasy look. And I wanted to point out too, his armor reminds me a lot of Brienne's armor when we first meet her when she is in Renly's Kingsguard. So I like that they're kind of keeping this through line in this Baratheon armor style. This is a thing that, all of the shows have been very good about, which is giving the different regions kind of distinct fashion, distinct dress. And I guess with that too, we're seeing, different regions have distinct armor as well, which we did kind of get in Game of Thrones. Dornish armor was very different from, say, other Westerosi armor. But I like that we're getting a little bit more hyper specific with it, in the sense that this seems like this is Stormlander type armor. But first, one last thing I wanted to add about Lionel Baratheon before moving on. A little thing that most people don't know is that his gray hairs are a wig. They're a little wig frontal piece to kind of give him that salt and pepper look. And this is another thing too, is the wigs this season are fabulous. And a lot of the times you don't know that they're wigs because they are so well done. Like this little frontal piece clearly looks like it's like hand tied. The hairs are, hand sewn in there. It is so detailed, so fine that basically no one clocked it until it was revealed on social media that it was a little hair piece. I think it looks so good. Like I said, I would have never known, and I just hope going forward with Thrones and Thrones adaptations that we get this level of care with the hair pieces, with the wigs, because in the past couple of years, they haven't been great. And it's not even just a Thrones thing. It's like Hollywood in general has been having a wig issue. A lot of people have talked about this. There are a lot of reasons behind it. Part of the reason why, at least this is what I was told, part of the reason why House of the Dragon had some less than stellar wigs in season 1 is because there was a human hair shortage during filming. I'm not sure what the wig situation is going to look like in season 3. We'll have to wait and see, but hopefully it's a little bit more like this. It looks a little bit better. I will say too, there are less wigs in A Night of the Seven Kingdoms. They have less wigs to be putting on people, so it's probably easier, and that's probably why they look better. They're able to put a little bit more attention and care versus House of the Dragon, where basically everyone is wearing a wig. It is like wig city in that show, so I can see why then the budget might be a little bit tighter, or it might be a little bit harder to get, beautiful, amazing wigs for everyone all the time, if that makes sense. Not trying to make excuses for it, just trying to, understand what's happening behind the scenes a little bit more. This little hairpiece on Lionel looks fabulous. I think this is a great look for this actor, for Daniel Ings, and I would have never known it was a wig. So anyways, moving on. So next, Tanzel. Tanzel has a ton of outfits in the show. She has at least 4. So let's talk about it. First, I want to talk about her night outfit. The outfit when she's dressed as Serwyn of the Mirror Shield when Aerion attacks her. So firstly, Peter Claffey said that when she had to wear this little coif on her head, I think that's what it's called, the little chainmail hat, that she looked like a baby and that she looked really cute, and I think it's really funny. But I do agree, she is kind of giving baby vibes in a good way, in a way that she's so adorable, and I can't believe Aerion would attack her. But it reminds me too of that audio that's like, why is he staring at me like that? What do you mean he's just a baby? What, do you have a staring problem? And he's like, it's a dumb little face. Like, do you know what? I'm just gonna put it here. I'm gonna put it here, and y'all will know what I mean.
Why is he looking at me like that? What's up, little bud? You got a staring problem, pal?
Like what, dude? He's just looking at you. He's a baby.
Look at his face. Dumb little face.
Stop.
Yo, Zen, get your boy, dog.
Hey.
So, reminds me of that. One thing that I think is interesting about Tamsin Crawford in this scene when she is dressed in the armor for Serwyn, the scene where Aerion attacks her, is that the armor is multiple colors. It's red and it's green, and it kind of reminds me of the fact that Florian the Fool wears motley. It's kind of multicolored look. So maybe it's a little bit of symbolism, a little bit of foreshadowing that it is foolish for them to be doing this play, Serwyn of the Mirror Shield, where a dragon dies. But also maybe it's to showcase that, they're mummers and they don't have, perfect matching armor. They kind of just have pieces thrown together here and there. Or maybe it's a little House of the Dragon nod, red and green. Probably not, but just had to throw that out there. So next, her other outfits. She's wearing a lot of blues. It seems like we're kind of associating her with these kind of blue and bluey green tones, which, like I said, Dunk also wears a lot of blues and greens, so I feel like it kind of shows that they're a little bit connected. But also this actress just looks really good in blue. I'm obsessed with this scene where she is, at the market. I think this color looks fabulous. I like that the fabric texture is very kind of sheer and crinkly. It reminds me of some of the fabrics that we see in Dorne, which makes sense because Tanzel and the other mummers are from Dorne. I also like too in this scene when she's wearing this kind of darker blue outfit, she has this beautiful hair wrap situation going on, and I would love to see a close-up of some of these kind of ribbon hair wraps that we get for her, because there's nothing I love more than a beautiful braided little medieval hairstyle. So I think it looks really nice, and I would love to get a closer look. But another thing that's interesting is on her gown, she has this kind of beautiful pattern on the skirt, and there are these black club shapes. And it's interesting because clubs represent agriculture, but also growth. And now I don't think that this was entirely intentional by the costume department. Who knows, maybe it was, but probably not. But I do think it is a little bit of a happy coincidence, maybe a little bit, not ironic, because I think ironic has a negative connotation, but it's a little bit kismet that she has these symbols of growth on her, because as we know, Dunk eventually does go looking for Tanzel. He tries to find her again, and he doesn't. But George R. R. Martin has said that he thinks they will meet up at some point later in life, probably when both of them have done a lot of growing and have changed a lot. So it's interesting that she has this symbol of growth on her. Also, it works well with the fact that this show has a lot of spring symbolism. The fact that she has a symbol of agriculture and growth on her kind of ties into that spring theme and spring element. Another thing I wanted to point out too is layering. We see her later on with different pieces layered together. We see elements of previous outfits she's worn, and I also think that is good costume design because, if you're a member of the small folk, if you're traveling here for this event, you're probably going to have to start like reusing and remixing some of your clothes. You won't have a brand new fresh outfit for every day. That's probably something that's only really reserved for the nobles. And now the last costume I wanted to talk about with her is when she is dressed as Jonquil. So Jonquil is this kind of legendary figure from, these love stories of Jonquil and Florian the Fool. And so she's kind of dressed as this larger than life embodiment of Jonquil. She's super tall in this beautiful white gown, almost like a goddess, almost like she is an embodiment of the maiden. The maiden is this aspect of the seven that is supposed to represent, maidenhood and love and all of these things. So it feels like she's kind of evoking this goddess-like figure, but she also on her head has this big beautiful crown that looks like the jonquil flower. And the jonquil flower is a type of daffodil. Again, a spring flower. We have this motif of spring associated with Tanzel. And it's to be noted too that jonquils are associated with love and affection. So it makes sense for the character of Jonquil, but it also makes sense for Tanzel as a character, knowing that she is Dunk's love interest for this season. And I will say though too, it's a little bit foreboding when we know what happens. There's this tagline in the show that spring is coming, which sounds like a hopeful thing, but for those of us who have read the novellas, we know that it's a little bit ominous because after this first season, the Great Spring Sickness hits Westeros. And I don't think that it's completely unintentional that she's dressed as Jonquil, as this, herald of spring, as this kind of symbol of spring, before she then later is dressed as Serwyn and she's attacked by Aerion. It almost feels like, not that it's cursed, but it feels like, spring is usually a hopeful thing, but in this sense, it feels a little bit like a bad omen. And in that way too, spring in general is a little bit of a bad omen or more negative thing. Like it's a little bit ominous for her fate and then also the fate of Westeros, if that makes sense. And the last thing I wanted to point out, this isn't really a costume thing, but more of a set piece thing. I've seen a couple other people talk about this. The Florian puppet looks a lot like Dunk, and that doesn't seem to be unintentional. They've given it Peter Claffey's blue eyes, and they seemingly have kind of modeled the Fool puppet after Dunk. And, he picks it up and looks at it, and I think that is all very interesting and intentional and a good use of set design. Oh, and I wanted to touch on too, I almost forgot. Tanzel has these gorgeous earrings that she wears. She has a couple pairs of really pretty earrings, and I would love to get a closer look at them. And I mentioned earlier with Lionel Baratheon, we see a lot of men wear earrings in the books. We get a couple instances of it, but we don't get instances of women wearing earrings. There's only actually one instance, and it is Sansa, and then never again. And I've seen people say, why are there no earrings in Game of Thrones? Why don't the women wear earrings? And I think it's because of that. I think it's because in the books, there's no mentioning of women wearing earrings. Or maybe it's just because, earrings can be a little bit annoying for continuity purposes. Maybe the show just didn't want to deal with extra accessories. Who knows? It seems like this is a thing that House of the Dragon and A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms is kind of doing away with. So it seems like we are getting more earrings on women in the shows going forward, which I'm here for. I always think adding extra layers and jewelry to the costumes adds depth and a level of visual interest. So I'm here for it. So yeah, just a little bit of an interesting detail. Additionally, too, we are getting more women with head dresses, head pieces, which I think is really cool. Game of Thrones had a severe lack of headwear on the women, cool little hats and crowns and things, so we will be talking a little bit about that as well. But moving on from Tanzel, moving on from that, Raymond Fossaway. So I've seen people say that Raymond has kind of this overall Podrick look, and I don't think that that's entirely unintentional. You know, the actor looks a little bit like him, and then I think they've styled him in armor that looks a little bit like Podrick's armor, in order to kind of easily characterize him as this good squire, loyal character. But we also do know that he is wearing red because he is from House Fossaway. And in the novellas, he has this moment after Lionel knights him where he runs off really quick and then paints a green apple on his shield and declares himself a green apple of Fossaway. And this is how we get the splitting of the houses. And eventually, you know, the green apple Fossaways live in a place called New Barrel, as opposed to the regular seat, the regular house called Cider Hall. And not their rival houses, but it's just a splitting of the houses. And we didn't get that in the show, but I don't think that we are completely out of luck with that. I think we might still get it, because in this still from the last episode, Raymond is wearing green, so I think there is still hope that we will get the green apple Fossaway scene, and I wouldn't be surprised if this is the moment where he tells Dunk about his new sigil and what he's doing. And next, Stefan Fossaway, Raymond's cousin. So I don't have too much to say about Stefan other than I think both sets of his apple armor are really cool. I hope that we get more cool armor like this in the future. I love the painted kind of armor that he's training in, that's really fun, and I like the armor that he wears to the tourney. I think it is absolutely stunning, and a breath of fresh air compared to some of the very boring armor we have gotten in the other shows. And now one other thing I wanted to touch on is, you know, Stefan and Raymond are constantly talking about how their house is very ancient, and how they were there, you know, before the Targaryens, and we do know that the Fossaways have Firstmen origins. They claim descent from Garth the Green Hand, and so with that, I think his armor, it's kind of this like bronze coppery color, which makes us think of the First Men. You know, the First Men worked with bronze and they didn't work with steel and iron. And so we see this kind of bronze and coppery armor too in the Vale, you know, evoking this very ancient household type stuff. But we do see that it is kind of covered in this ornate kind of scroll work and apple motifs, which feels very new. Feels very new money, feels very new lord. It kind of makes us think of that line that Steely Pate said about, you know, he makes just good standard armor. He doesn't make armor with, you know, queer foreign fruits and, you know, fancy little things on it. So even though Stefan is hyping up his house as like ancient and honorable, I think the visual of his armor gives us that indication that actually, no, this guy is much more new money, much more new minded in what he will do for his house and what he will do for a lordship. Hopefully that makes sense. Like, the flashiness of his armor gives us a little bit of indication towards his morals. So next, Daeron. Daeron and his costuming seems like he wants to blend in with the background. We see this quite a bit when he's in the inn. You know, he's not in this super flashy Targaryen red. He's kind of in these more muted colors, and then he kind of blends in with the shadows in the background almost, and with the wood tones. And then when we see him in other instances, he's in all black, and he kind of seems like he doesn't want to be there. His cloak almost feels like a blanket. It has these very subtle textures on it that you would almost miss. Very muted, very understated, and that feels very in line with who he is as a character. He does not want to be seen. He just wants to fade into the background. He wants to get drunk. He wants to, you know, pass out and just sleep and be away from the world. He doesn't want to flash around his Targaryenness. He doesn't want to do any of that. And that sentiment seems to be carried over with his armor, except for one little detail. So while his armor is nowhere near as flashy as Valarr's or Aerion's, it does have this kind of interesting red rippling to it that reminds me of two things. One, it reminds me a little bit of the kind of book description of Valyrian steel. Not saying this armor is Valyrian steel. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is it just kind of has the look to it, which makes sense for, you know, a very magical character. He's a dragon dreamer. He's tied to this kind of magical dragon dreaming of old Valyria, so it makes sense that his armor kind of subtly, subliminally kind of evokes that. It also reminds me of weirwood bark. It's this kind of silvery white with these little red veins in it and stuff, and again, weirwoods are very magical, and so I don't think it's a coincidence that they've given this magical dragon dreaming character armor that evokes these two different, very kind of magically things. And I think it goes directly against the theory that I've been seeing that Daeron sold his armor and they just had to find him something to wear. I just don't think that's the case. I think this definitely probably is his armor. I just think he is a more understated character. Because also too, if that was the case, then why wouldn't Baelor just go out and also buy some new armor and find some new armor? Why would he be wearing his son's armor, you know? So next, speaking of Baelor, Baelor's costuming is sleek and understated in a way that denotes this air of confidence that I feel like we don't quite see from Maekar. Get into that in a little bit. And I wanted to mention too, Baelor seems to be dressing in kind of subdued, dark clothes, things that are a bit more, I don't want to say humble, but maybe just a bit more plain. And this is in line with how he looks in the book. So this is a description from the Hedge Knight. It says, "His short cropped hair was dark and peppered with gray. His strong jaw clean shaven. His nose looked as though it had been broken more than once. Though he was dressed very plainly in green doublet, brown mantle, and scuffed boots, there was a weight to him, a sense of power and certainty." So while he's not, clean shaven, I do think they have done a decent job at, portraying this character, giving him that short cropped hair and giving him these somewhat plain clothes, but he still kind of retains this air of regality just by his presence alone. And I also wanted to point out too, I really like that the actor, Bertie Carvel, is interacting with the costume. He's twisting this ring that he has around his finger. And to me, it's little details like this that turn a costume from a costume into the character's clothes. It makes it a little more believable when an actor is willing to interact with the clothes that he's wearing, as opposed to being too stiff in them and too scared to mess them up or get them dirty. This is something that people would praise Philip Seymour Hoffman for quite a bit, where, when he was in character, he never looked like he was wearing a costume. He always looked like he was wearing his clothes. And I think both Bertie and Sam, who plays Maekar, do a really good job at this. We see Maekar kind of, move around in his collar uncomfortably. He's interacting with the clothes in a way that makes it feel real, almost like it is a tool or a prop for the actor, as opposed to, a hindrance or something that is out of place. And I think this is just, again, a marker of, really good and interesting costume design, costumes that are meant to be interacted with, as much as the sets or as much as, the dialogue. Because we also see Dexter, obviously, like I previously mentioned, with this cloak that is meant to get kind of muddy and dirty and heavy. They're not too, worried about the cloak staying pristine. They want it to look a little bit weathered and worn, and these outfits are kind of there in a way to help the actors as much as they are to build the world and build the show. I kind of wish we got a little bit of a closer look at this ring. I mean, maybe some stills will come out at some point. I just think it looks really cool. And it sounds random, but it kind of reminds me of how Aragorn has his ring, the fact that Baelor has this, ring that he's kind of always fussing with. Like I said, he ends up wearing his son's armor. He didn't bring his own armor to the tourney because he didn't think he would be fighting in the tourney. So he is wearing his son's armor, and that is why he dies, is because the helmet does not fit him properly. It's not fitted to him or his measurements, and it made it kind of dangerous. And I feel like that's a detail a lot of people will miss, is that he wasn't wearing his own armor, he was wearing his son's armor. And one last little detail, this has kind of been debated back and forth when the show came out, whether or not Baelor had heterochromia. And yes, he does. This was mentioned in one of the after the episodes, inside the episodes. He does have one brown eye and one blue eye. It is very subtle though. Personally, I did not pick up on it in episodes, but they said, yeah, it was there that he was wearing a contact. So there's that. And now next, Maekar. Maekar is also sleek. He has these really interesting, Targaryen shoulders going on. I feel like we see that in a lot of Targaryen costuming, these kind of interesting lines and shoulders. But I will say, even though he is the fourth-born brother and is supposed to be kind of no nonsense and not as caring and a little bit more practical, I feel like we do see in his clothing and in his armor that he does care and he is trying to put on a front. Because, like, for example, one, just look at his armor compared to the armor Baelor wears. It's very much in line and matching with Aerion in a way, but also look at the way his horse is armored. Very kind of flashy and fancy looking, whereas Baelor's horse looks a little bit more practical, a little bit more simple. And to me, what this says is I think Maekar is trying to present like he doesn't care, but I think he does actually really care. I think he wants approval in a way. I think he is frustrated that his kids are acting this way. He's trying his best. He is the fourth-born son. He's got a little bit of a chip on his shoulder because of that. And it's interesting because he, in the books, has his own sigil. It's a 4-quartered dragon. They did not have this in the show. This seemingly was a mistake according to Ira Parker's AMA. But just kind of an interesting detail to note nonetheless, that Maekar is trying to stand out and differentiate himself from his brothers, with his sigil, with his clothes, with his horse, all these things. But subtly. He's trying to do it very subtly. So Sam Spurrell actually did not wear a wig. They did bleach his hair. And his haircut is very interesting in this because it's kind of no nonsense and very, it feels pristine. I've seen people point out and say it feels like he got a haircut once in his youth and then thought, that's good enough. This is the haircut I will have for the rest of my life. Kind of clean, no nonsense. But it is interesting that it's longer than Baelor's, and he has this silver hair, of course, so it's kind of giving this vibe of like, I want to make sure that everyone sees I have the silver Targaryen hair, I am a prince, but also I'm not going to be too fussy about it. Because in other scenes too, it's like, we can see that it's not quite parted perfectly. It's like he's orderly and in line to a point, but it's not quite perfect. He doesn't quite care too much, but he does care a bit. And I feel like we see that through his clothes as well, you know, whereas Baelor is constantly kind of in these blacks, we do see that Maekar is dressed up a little bit more, but not so much that he looks fussy, but he is wearing, you know, more of that Targaryen red, and he does have more layers going on, more layers that at least are noticeable. And we kind of talked about layers a little bit earlier with Dunk, and we're going to talk about them a little bit later with Rafe, but it's interesting how layers and different textures can evoke different things, you know, because obviously with Dunk, if you have a lot of these kind of rough spun textures layered on each other, these kind of clothes that have holes in them and stuff, it definitely depicts a different story than if you have these very rich fabrics all layered on top of each other like we get with Maekar. You know, we have like silk, and it looks like maybe leathers and velvets and all different kinds of pins and buttons and things. It denotes, you know, richness, it denotes finery and expensiveness. And I like too that if you zoom in on his costume, again, we see these kind of like dragony, lizardy textures all in his outfit, but again, it just feels a little bit subdued, but more prominent than maybe Baelor's outfits. And this kind of lines up with Maekar as a character, since we know that he is the fourth born, and maybe there's a little bit of jealousy there, a little bit of rivalry with Baelor. Obviously, he loves his family, but he does kind of feel like he needs to prove himself a little bit more. And fun fact, like I said, this hair is not a wig, but his beard is a wig. I feel like it looks fabulous. They did a really good job. I would have never known. And another thing I wanted to point out too is he is carrying an eared dagger. Him and Aerion are both carrying these interesting eared daggers. And this is a thing that we started seeing in House of the Dragon. Daemon carries one. Corlys Velaryon carries one. This is just a type of medieval dagger that has this like this thing on the hilt, on the handle. I don't really know what's going on with these daggers. I think though, seeing Daemon carry one, Corlys, and then Aerion, and then Maekar, I'm gonna go out on a limb and say maybe this is a Valyrian style dagger. Obviously, maybe there are multiple styles of Valyrian dagger. It's not a magical dagger. I'm just saying that. I'm just saying it's a very specific style of dagger that we really only see carried by Valyrians. So there's that. Just an interesting little through line from House of the Dragon to A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms. And I was thinking too that maybe Aerion's is Daemon's, but looking at them, they do look like different daggers, so there's that. I think this is just a style that's preferred by the royals and the very rich people because it's kind of cool and different and unique and all that. So next, moving on to Aerion. The way that Aerion dresses is not as out there as he is in the books. In the books, he dresses in a lot of bright colors, and that's why he's called Aerion Brightflame. Whereas in the show, he's a little more subdued, but he is still in this kind of bright red velvet. I like that his sleeves are kind of studded. And a thing to note too is he's wearing chainmail under his clothes when he's walking around. And to me, what this shows is that he is looking for a fight. And he's looking for a fight in kind of a stupid way because he's wearing it openly. Like when Roose Bolton was wearing chainmail, the only reason Kat knew is because he kind of like, you know, she lifted up his shirt and saw it. He was hiding it. Whereas Aerion is just like, it just shows that he's walking around looking for a fight, you know? And it's also stupid because he's not protecting his face. Like, anyone's gonna see the chainmail and think, oh, he's wearing chainmail, I'm not gonna attack the chest. I'm gonna probably go for his neck or face first. So it's like, he's thinking one step ahead, but not two steps ahead. He's not thinking ahead enough before he does these things, which is very in line for his character and who he is. So with that, just very good characterization through costume. And the next thing too is this is a wig. Finn Bennett is wearing a wig. A lot of people did not know this, but they did not bleach his hair. Again, the wigs in this show have been fabulous. And with the styling of it, they said that they kind of gave him these little flicky, little spiky bits because it's kind of evoking a dragon, you know, with its little scales or horns or something. And that is so funny to me because it implies that Aerion every morning in the mirror is sitting there with his gel, just like flicking his hair up because he really does think that he's a dragon. And this ties into his armor as well. You know, he has this really cool black intimidating armor with this flaming head. And obviously it's black and red to kind of intimidate other people. His clothes cloak as well kind of has this like blood look to it. It's like velvety, but it's got these kind of veins in it that, you know, kind of look like marble, like very rich, but also kind of like veins and blood, so very kind of spooky and intimidating. He's kind of being an edgelord. But the thing that's interesting is that in the main series and in the World of Ice and Fire, in the books in general, we are told that dragon bones are black. So it being this kind of black flaming skull again makes me think that Aerion really does think that he's a dragon, and we're seeing that in his visual presentation. And the last thing I wanted to touch on too with Aerion, in the books he does also have his own sigil. It's like a tri-colored dragon. In the show he does not have that. They've seemingly given him a gold dragon, so just something to note. Next, Valarr. Valarr is similar to his father, similar to, you know, Baelor, sleek and understated. He's kind of this nonchalant prince, but he does have these little markers that kind of make him stick out as an interesting character. One of those is his heterochromia, and the other thing is his little blonde hair streak. Overall though, I think he is kind of understated and sleek in order to kind of juxtapose him against Aerion, who is, like I said, a little bit of an edgelord, a little bit more colorful, a little bit more of a punk. You know, Aerion has this like spiky little hair. Valarr has very sleek, kind of well-groomed hair. Little details like that. And I've seen people saying, why did Valarr not fight for Dunk? Valarr should have fought for Dunk. And to that I say, him and Baelor only had one set of armor between them. Also, practicality reasons, it's already really crazy that the heir to the throne is fighting in this, and that his brother is fighting in this, and that the brother's son is fighting in this. Like, that is a lot. It would be even worse if the heir and the heir's heir fought. Like, that's just too big of a risk, and it was already an incredibly risky thing. So I think it's understandable why Valarr did not fight. The last thing I want to say too about Valarr is I want to talk about his wife, Kira of Tyrells. So we get a brief glimpse of her in the trailer, and I think we will be seeing her in this final episode. Kira is from Tyrells, which is across the Narrow Sea, and in Tyrells, people often dye their hair fun, colorful colors. We see this with characters like Daario Naharis dyeing his hair blue and his mustache gold, and we see this with Kira. She has pink hair, which I think is very fun. It feels like a little nod to book readers. So I'm very excited to see her and her pink hair. And it's interesting too because we've gotten a couple different men so far with colorful hair. We got some like Tyroshi pirates in House of the Dragon, but I don't think we've gotten a woman yet with colorful hair. So I'm excited. And speaking of colorful hair, let's talk about Beesbury, Sir Humphrey Beesbury. This is a character that I wish we would have touched on a little bit more in the show. We didn't get his backstory. Basically, Sir Humphrey Beesbury, of House Beesbury, came to the joust and had a really amazing day of jousting against Sir Humphrey Harding, so much so that it was called the Battle of the Humphreys. Everyone really liked it. And we're also told that Sir Humphrey Beesbury is the brother-in-law of Sir Humphrey Harding. So these two came for a fun day of jousting, having a good time, and the fact that Aerion then, you know, unchivalrously kind of unhorsed and attacked and killed the horse of Sir Humphrey Harding probably pissed Beesbury off quite a bit. So I wish we would have gotten that background a little bit in order to know why he was fighting for Dunk, but alas. So a couple things about Beesbury. One, fun gold mustache. Like I said, people in this world, in Tyrells and stuff, dye their hair colorful, fun colors. This is not as common in Westeros, and so when we do see it, it's usually in characters who are a little bit more rebellious, a little bit more outspoken, or going against the grain. We have characters like Willa Manderly in the books, who dyes her hair kind of this garish green and rebellion. So seeing Beesbury with a fun gold mustache kind of tells me that this is a fun, kind of loud, boisterous, maybe a little bit rebellious, a little bit going against the grain character, which makes sense for him then siding with Dunk. 2, his armor. His armor is kind of cool and fun. I like that they stuck with the, beehives on his, I think it's mantle. I just wish we would have gotten a really cool helm for him. There is some really cool fan art out there of a kind of bee helm, but alas, I'm okay with what we got because unfortunately we don't get to stick around with Sir Humphrey Beesbury very long. And next with Beesbury, let's talk about Sir Humphrey Harding. So there's not too much to talk about with Humphrey Harding. His armor does seem to have his house sigil on it. It seems to be a bit understated, which again kind of goes into this characterization that him and Beesbury, him and his brother-in-law, just came to this tourney to have fun. They came to break some lances, to have a good chivalrous time. You know, they're just no-nonsense good knights. And now the only other thing I will point out about Sir Humphrey Harding, it's not a costume thing, but it is kind of a set thing, is that on the top of his pavilion there is this pointed spike, and you'd think that with his sigil being this kind of checkered diamond pattern, it would be like a diamond, but I think that maybe it's kind of a point because it's a bee stinger, because like I said, they're brother-in-laws, so maybe Sir Humphrey Harding is married to Beesbury's sister. Or maybe it's just a symbol that him and Beesbury are really close, really tight. Either either way, kind of a fun detail. And so next, Robin Risling. This character is like barely touched upon in the books, and I feel like they've done a really good job at fleshing him out in the show, giving him this very interesting, almost like religious spin to him, where he thinks he's basically the warrior incarnate. And I feel like we see that with his clothes and with his armor. He has this very interesting kind of slashed doublet, which looks like a warrior that's taken a bunch of cuts. And he has this cool, almost like sage style walking stick. And then with his armor is not flashy, no nonsense, just hard, gritty chainmail. So again, he's not showing off any personal sigils, heraldry, anything. It really just feels like he's like, no, I am just a blank warrior. I am a vessel for the god. And one other thing too that I wanted to point out that was kind of interesting and weird is the armor of his horse. Yes, I'm bringing up horses again. We are also analyzing the horse costumes in this. Is that his horse is in like burlap sack armor is what I've seen it described as. He's in all this like woven stuff and wooden beads, and I don't know why. Maybe it's because he thinks like, you know, my horse doesn't need flashy armor, the warrior will protect me. To me it looked a little bit like Dothraki almost, which would make sense because like Arlen was singing in Dothraki, and the Dothraki are like known to be really crazy good warriors. So I was like, oh, maybe it's that. But then I went to look at some of the Dothraki kind of horse attire in Game of Thrones and was like, oh no, actually these horses are just in really modern looking bridles and tribal blankets, which kind of takes me out of it a little bit. Kind of feel like they should have been in something closer to this, but alas, it is an incredibly pedantic and weird detail to notice. But still, I want to know, like, why is his horse dressed like this? I don't know. Anyways, moving on. Okay, so moving on now to some of the more minor side characters. I did want to touch on the Lord Ashford and his daughter Gwyn. You can tell that the Lord Ashford thinks that he is very important by all of the fancy gold jewelry that he's wearing. He's wearing a lot of gold stuff, and you can tell that he has overspent on his daughter's birthday by the fact that she has not one, not two, but three very fancy, very sparkly gold flecked dresses and multiple sets of jewelry, which include multiple tiaras. She has, you know, two beautiful necklaces. One has these kind of gold bead things and one has these pearls, two sets of earrings, and like I said, two tiaras. She has a tiara that has a little sun motif on it and then one that is just leaves. So I think this is just a very good visual indication that she is I don't want to say spoiled, but like very well loved princess, and she is the princess of her birthday party. Entire event is for her, and you can tell just by looking at her. Next, let's talk about the brothel workers a little bit. So when I talked about the costumes originally, it was before the show came out, and I was kind of theorizing, hey, maybe these brothel workers are a little bit evoking Dornish styles, maybe something's going on here, but I thought that they weren't quite noble women. I thought maybe they were brothel workers, and I was correct in that. Not super correct they were emulating Dornish women, but alas. But with that, I do really like their costumes. I think they're really interesting, and I think it's notable and interesting that they are wearing some of the brightest colors, which feels intentional, probably for advertising purposes, but also we see this through line in Game of Thrones where the brothel workers wear flashier, brighter colors, I think in order to show that they are not quite high class, but they're trying to emulate the high class. And in the same sense too, I saw people saying this wig is terrible, but then it's revealed to us in the show that it is supposed to be a wig in the show as well. It's not supposed to be her hair, so I think it's intentionally kind of a bad looking wig. And with that too, I feel like you can see that some of them are wearing kind of some clunky, cheap looking costume jewelry, some costumey pieces. When they are trying to emulate nobility, they try their best. We see this with Red when she is in the stands for the joust, and I'm gonna say it, she did a really good job emulating the nobles because it fooled a lot of fans watching the show. A lot of people did not know who this was because she had done her hair a little bit differently and had put on a little bit more of a smudged brown under eye and done her eyebrows up a little bit. People thought that this was a completely different woman. They're like, who is that? Is this Rohan Weber? No, it's Red from the first couple episodes, but she has just done herself up a little bit more because she is there escorting, likely Manfred Dondarrion. She's probably there as his, consort, as his escort, and so with that, she has done herself up a little bit to look good for the other nobles, to try to kind of mimic and cosplay a noble, maybe to find other clients, etc. And so with that, a little bit of makeup analysis, like I said, she has done up her eyebrows a little bit more, she kind of has this smudged brown eyeshadow going on, a little bit more of a cheek, a little bit more of a lip, and it looks like some bronzer, and then her hair is done up. She also has a new necklace on. It makes me wonder if this was maybe a gift from one of her patrons, maybe from Manfred, but you can tell it's new based on how kind of bright it is compared to her other jewelry, which is a little bit more tarnished. So just subtle details like this I think are really interesting. And now I don't have too much more to say about some of the other kind of smaller characters. Steely Pate, I feel like his costume showcases his character. He is a laborer and he is no nonsense. And then young Dunk and Rafe, I think the helmet that Rafe wears is really interesting. It's kind of this winged helm that she probably, scavenged from a battlefield. And it makes me wonder what house this was from. Do we think maybe it's like an Aerion helm? It looks so different from anything we've ever seen though that I'm not quite confident in saying that's what it is. And I want to talk about Rafe a little bit. We don't see her for very long, but her costume, I feel like, tells a story. So again, with the layers, we're getting a lot of layers, but instead of, really fine layers that denote a lot of wealth, that you can afford a lot of different fabrics and pleats and things, we see Rafe in these kind of homely, rough spun layers that are, bits and pieces that she's probably found over time. We have this kind of interesting netting piece. We have this like hoodie that she has underneath that seems like she could probably pull it over her face in order to hide her identity when she's stealing things. We have this little skirt hike, which is kind of fun. I think this might be the first time we've seen a little skirt hike type thing in these shows. And then we have, it looks like a little satchel for maybe money, maybe it's a wineskin, I can't tell, and then her little belt for her knife, and then this kind of woven rope belt, which makes me think of Dunk's woven rope belt. So overall, just a lot of interesting layered little pieces and details that I feel like tell a story with this character. We got the practicality of the skirt hike, we got the layers to try to cover herself a little bit more, we got the utilitarian little cowl around the neck, we got her knife, we got her, money pouch. She has basically everything she needs to survive right here. And if we zoom in too, we can even see like little stitches and little things that denote, maybe she has tried mend and maintain these garments that she has over time. Anyways, but overall, I think this is a really fun, really fabulous costume for a character that we don't spend a lot of time with. Costumes don't always need to be beautiful and pretty to be good. As long as they tell a story, that is, in my opinion, good, successful costume. I mean, and sometimes they don't even need to tell a story. Sometimes it just needs to serve the scene. But with a show like this, I feel like a lot of the time, the more detail you can put into a costume, the more thought and love that goes into it, it really pays off, because people do pay attention to these details and it adds to the believability of the world. Now, I did also want to touch on Leo Tyrell because, hooray, we're finally getting Tyrells in green. So for the Tyrells, their house colors are supposed to be green and gold, but in Game of Thrones, for some reason, they almost exclusively wear blue. And I'm not saying for some reason, I do know the reason why. Michelle Clapton said that they kind of started out in greens. We get Marjorie in green like once, but then she said they kind of elevate to blues and golds to show that they're trying to elevate their house and become something different. I get it. I still don't love it because we get a lot of characters in Game of Thrones wearing blue. It would have been nice to get more green. So with this, I like that Leo Tyrell is wearing green. I like that he's wearing green and gold. And lastly, I want to talk about the Kingsguard armor. I almost forgot to talk about this, which is crazy. I think it's because I had talked about this previously over on Instagram and TikTok, so it just slipped my mind. But wow, this Kingsguard armor is fantastic. I think this is my favorite iteration of the Kingsguard armor we've gotten yet. It looks, again, like basically ripped from the graphic novel. It is very accurate to that look, which I love. And I like that it is white, the Kingsguard are supposed to be kind of garbed in white. They have these white cloaks, but in the past we've gotten, various different versions of the Kingsguard, and they all have had different looks for good reasons. In House of the Dragon, the Kingsguard armor feels a bit more detailed, more ornate, which makes sense for the time, House of the Dragon is supposed to be the height of the Targaryens' power and wealth, so it makes sense that this would be also the armor that has the most, ornate scroll work and extra stuff going on with it, whereas the Kingsguard armor in A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, that time period is supposed to be kind of a renaissance for House Targaryen, but again, they're not at the height of opulence like they were. They're not at the height of their power like they were when they had the dragons. So we do still get some very nice looking, very beautiful Kingsguard armor, but maybe not as ornate and opulent as in House of the Dragon. And then when we get to Game of Thrones, the Kingsguard armor, the costume designers have said that at the beginning it is detailed with gold in order to give us this indication that the Lannisters are actually the ones in power. And I feel like this is emphasized by the fact, too, that when Robert visits the Starks in Winterfell, you'll notice there are no Baratheon banners. There are actually only a couple of Lannister banners. So the Kingsguard are very reflective of the current politics. And as the show goes on, as the Lannisters gain more power, you'll notice that the Kingsguard armor becomes more and more gold. And this is until Cersei then eventually comes into power and kind of switches it up. She creates her own personal emblem with her own crown, and then the Kingsguard after that mimic her. And then the last Kingsguard armor I want to point out is the Kingsguard armor that we see during the Tower of Joy scene. And this armor I think is interesting because it looks kind of dingy and worn down. I think visually it gives us that indication that, you know, this is close to the end of the war and the Targaryens are losing. I've had some people say, oh, well, this doesn't make sense. The Targaryens had the height of wealth at this time. And to that I say, yeah, you know, they might have had a lot of wealth, but they are still losing the war. And again, also this is in Dorne, so it makes sense the armor looks a little bit dingy and sandy and maybe dirty. They're kind of at the end of their rope, and also visually it's supposed to be this indication of the end of the dynasty, the end of the era. So it wouldn't really make sense to have them in perfect, beautiful, brand new, shiny looking armor if they're trying to evoke all these things. You know, the end of the war, the end of the dynasty, Targaryens at the end of their rope, in essence. So for that reason, I actually think that this Kingsguard armor is effective for the storytelling element, for what it's trying to showcase to us in a very short amount of time on screen. And I want to come back to this Kingsguard armor because it's another thing I wanted to point out. We talked about kind of weathering, and I like that this armor looks a bit weathered. It looks real, but it is also still very clean, and it's not like scratched or dented really. And to me, that depicts this idea that the Kingsguard, you know, are pristine and intimidating fighters. It's this idea of like, oh, you know, people are always missing when they, you know, attack them. It's that kind of that line from Jaime of, you know, oh, they always swing at me, but they always miss. It's something like that. I'm misquoting it. But it kind of gives that indication. And they could have just made this like brand new, clean, shiny armor, but I do appreciate that they have, it looks like, weathered it a little bit. So it does look like this is maybe armor that is a little more utilitarian or passed down as opposed to brand new and shiny. Because sometimes brand new and shiny can make it look, again, not as real, not as realistic. But also, too, it could be a lighting thing. I've seen people point out that in this scene, the lighting is a little bit dim, so maybe it's making the armor look a little bit more weathered and dingy than it's intended. And that could be because, you know, these two Kingsguard are talking to Dunk about their humble beginnings. They're being a little bit more human and real. And then when they kind of walk away into the light, the armor is like white and shiny and gleaming, almost like they are otherworldly. So it's kind of a thematic kind of storytelling thing that's going on with the armor and the lighting, which I think is very fun. And lastly, the fortune teller, just going to touch on this again. I made a whole video about her, but I do think it's interesting, again, that she kind of has this purple thing going on. Purple is a very witchy color, kind of reminds me of Alice Rivers. She also is covered in these daisies, but again, the fabrics are like kind of purple and blackened, kind of tarnished, and so it kind of gives this idea of, you know, a wilted spring, kind of this omen of what is to come in the future of the story. It can't be spring forever. It can't always be good and happy. There are some doomy things kind of looming over the horizon. So with that too, I wanted to touch on this again because I'm still seeing people in my comments say it. I don't think her lips are blue because she drinks Shade of the Evening. I think that's just makeup. Shade of the Evening is what the warlocks in Karth drink, and it's why their lips are blue. It's the same reason why Euron Greyjoy's lips are blue. These trees only grow in Essos, and that's the only place you can get Shade of the Evening. I imagine it's probably a pretty expensive drink to be drinking. It's probably pretty difficult to come by. So with that, I don't think that this prophetess, this fortune teller woods witch is drinking that. I think she might just have, you know, some dark makeup on. Also because I think her cup is not a drinking cup. I think it's a cup for coins. Maybe she's drinking something else. Maybe she's drinking hippocras or very dark wine, or maybe she's drinking a combination of other herbs or something. But I just think it would be weird for them to introduce Shade of the Evening in this way. I mean, there's no mention of it. There's no reference to it. So why would it be that? I don't know. Just my thoughts on it. So anyways, that was a lot of rambling thoughts on the costumes and the costume design. I'm sure with the finale, I will have some more thoughts. Maybe I'll do a follow-up video, but you'll have to let me know what you think. Have you liked the costumes this season? Are there any little details that you think I've missed? Feel free to make other connections in the comments below. And lastly, if you've made it this far, thank you so much for watching this video. And if you like content like this, make sure to subscribe and hit that bell notification, and make sure to follow me on the other apps, Instagram and TikTok, because I do post different content on all the different apps. Anyways, thank you so much for watching, and see you next week.